Ethan Hayes watched the clock on the wall. The ticking of the second hand was steady, rhythmic, like the beat of a heart. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, every tick echoing louder in the stillness of the clinic. It was a familiar kind of silence, the kind that usually meant the night was winding down. The kind of silence that made it easy to slip into the comfort of routine. But tonight, it felt different. The air felt heavier, thick with something he couldn't quite place. He pushed the thought away and focused on the phone call. The urgency in Ben's voice had unsettled him. Ethan's fingers lingered on the receiver as he waited for Ben to arrive. The weight of his professional responsibility hung on his shoulders, but there was something else too, a creeping sense of dread. Minutes seemed to stretch longer than usual as he stood in the quiet clinic, listening to the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. His mind wandered to the details of the phone call. Ben Carter. He knew Ben well. He was a local handyman, a solid man with a good heart. Ben had always been dependable, but there was something about the way he spoke that night that made Ethan uneasy. The desperation in his voice, the way he had said, "It doesn't look like it'll make it through the night." Ethan knew he had to prepare for the worst. The creature, whatever it was in bad shape. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the clinic door opening. Ben stepped inside, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with concern. "I found it," Ben said, his voice rough like he'd been running. He carefully cradled the bundle wrapped in the worn flannel jacket, his arms shaking slightly. Ethan immediately stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let me see," Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite the growing tension. Ben gently unwrapped the jacket, revealing the tiny creature inside. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its skin was almost translucent, so thin that the veins underneath were visible in stark relief. Its body was small and frail, and its oversized head seemed almost too large for its tiny frame. Its eyes, though tightly shut, were abnormally large, their lids twitching as though it could sense the presence of others. Its tiny limbs were spindly, like those of a newborn bird, delicate and fragile. Ethan reached out cautiously, his fingers trembling slightly as he took the creature from Ben's arms. He could feel its rapid heartbeat against his palm, the faint flutter of life that seemed so fragile. The creature let out a soft whimper, its body trembling in his hands. "What is it?" Ben whispered, his voice filled with awe and confusion. "It doesn't look like any puppy I've ever seen." Ethan didn't answer right away. He was too focused on the creature in his hands. His mind raced as he examined it closely. Its features were strange, alien even. Its elongated muzzle, its thin, delicate limbs, its impossibly large eyes. None of it made sense. The more he looked at it, the more the unease grew inside him. This was no ordinary animal. This wasn't a puppy. But what was it? Ethan looked up at Ben, his face serious. Get me some warm blankets and start setting up the incubator, he said. We need to stabilize it. Ben nodded quickly and hurried to the supply room. Ethan carefully laid the creature down on the examination table, his hands shaking as he adjusted its tiny body. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just any case. The clinic, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt like an unfamiliar, unsettling space. Every corner seemed to hold secrets. Every flicker of the overhead lights felt like a warning. The creature's unsettling nature. As Ethan began to work, he couldn't help but notice how the creature's body responded to his touch. It was almost as if it could sense his presence. Its eyes, still closed, fluttered again, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a faint glimmer of light behind its eyelids. It wasn't possible. The creature's eyes were still closed, yet there was something in the way it reacted to him that felt aware. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the unease in his chest only grew stronger. Grace had returned to the clinic by then, her eyes wide with concern when she saw the creature on the exam table. She immediately started preparing the warming pad and gathering the necessary supplies. Ethan worked silently, his mind racing as he carefully monitored the creature's vital signs. He could feel its heartbeat slowing, but not enough to give him hope. This creature was barely holding on. But it wasn't just the creature's condition that was troubling. It was the way it seemed to respond to them, to the environment around it. For a moment, Ethan glanced up at the small window in the exam room, the moonlight filtering through the blinds. The wind outside howled softly, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a shadow move across the window. He quickly turned away, shaking his head. It was just the wind. It had to be. Grace glanced at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Dr. Hayes, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Ethan nodded, though his heart was still racing. "I'm fine. We just need to focus on this." A growing mystery. As the night stretched on, Ethan's concern deepened. The creature's condition wasn't improving. Despite the warmth, despite the fluids he was administering, it seemed to grow weaker with each passing hour. He checked its vital signs again. Heart rate, low. Temperature, still too low. Oxygen levels, critical. Ethan stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he stared down at the creature. It was so small, so fragile, and yet there was something about it that seemed different. The oversized eyes, the way its limbs twitched with an almost unnatural speed, the way it seemed to react to light, to movement, to sound, in a way that no normal puppy ever would. Ethan glanced over at Grace. She had been working tirelessly alongside him, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't say it, but Ethan knew what she was thinking. What was this thing? And more importantly, Why had it been left in the woods, abandoned and alone? The breakthrough hours passed, and the night stretched into early morning. Ethan had almost given up hope when something unexpected happened. The creature stirred. Its body trembled, and its large eyes fluttered open for the first time. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He leaned in closer, his breath caught in his throat. The creature's eyes were no longer just large. They were glowing faintly, a soft, ethereal light radiating from them. It wasn't just the size of its eyes that was unsettling. It was the way they seemed to reflect something beyond the clinic, something beyond the walls of the room. Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. What was this thing? The creature's gaze met his, and for a moment it seemed as though it could see straight through him. There was something in its eyes, something ancient, something knowing. Ethan stood frozen, staring into the creature's glowing eyes. The room seemed to grow colder, and a strange pressure settled over him. His heart raced, each beat pounding in his ears. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, charged with something he couldn't name. The creature, still lying motionless on the exam table, continued to gaze at him with those unearthly eyes. They were unlike any eyes he had ever seen. Too large, too expressive, as though they held the secrets of the universe within them. Ethan blinked, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something flicker in the creature's gaze. Something fleeting, something almost human. But when he looked again, the moment was gone, and all that remained were those eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the clinic. Grace, who had been preparing more fluids, noticed Ethan's stillness and turned toward him. "Doctor Hayes," she asked, her voice a soft whisper, as if afraid to disturb the fragile moment. Ethan didn't respond right away. His mind was racing, spinning with questions, each one more urgent than the last. What was this creature? How had it come to be here, in Pine Haven, so far from any known wild animal habitats? "Dr. Hayes?" Grace repeated, stepping closer to him. He tore his gaze away from the creature and met Grace's eyes. She was watching him closely, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is it?" she began, but her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish the question. They both knew what they were thinking. Was this thing alive? Was it even an animal at all? Ethan cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. "We need to keep monitoring it," he said, though his voice sounded strained, uncertain. He turned back to the creature, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly still. Time seemed to stretch, the ticking of the clock on the wall almost drowned out by the sound of his own breath. The creature's awakening. As Ethan reached for the syringe to administer another round of fluids, the creature made a small, strangled noise. It wasn't a bark, nor was it a whimper. It was something in between, a sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The creature's eyes flickered again, and this time they didn't close. They remained wide open, staring unblinking at Ethan. A strange sensation washed over him, as though the creature was trying to communicate with him, trying to reach into his very soul. He took a step back, almost involuntarily, his heart hammering in his chest. The room seemed to contract around him, the walls pressing in. The creature's gaze didn't waver. There was something in those eyes, something so intense that Ethan felt like he was being pulled into a different world entirely. Dr. Hayes, it's not normal, Grace whispered, her voice trembling. She was staring at the creature, her face pale. What is it? Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't have an answer. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The creature's features were so alien, so unlike anything he had encountered in his years of practice. The oversized eyes, the fragile limbs, the way it seemed to respond to light and sound, none of it made sense. Maybe we should call someone, Grace suggested hesitantly. Someone from outside the town, a specialist or a biologist maybe? Ethan hesitated. He knew that if they called someone, the creature would be taken away, examined by experts who would surely see it as nothing more than a freak of nature. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the right course of action. There was something more to this creature, something important. He looked at Grace, his expression serious. Number, we're not calling anyone. We're going to take care of it here. It needs us. A connection forms. As the night wore on, the creature's condition slowly stabilized. The glow in its eyes began to fade, and its breathing, though still shallow, became more regular. Ethan and Grace worked tirelessly, monitoring its vitals, providing warmth and fluids. Despite the strange and unsettling nature of the creature, they both felt a growing bond with it. It was as if, in some strange way, they had become its guardians. But there was still something unsettling about the creature. Despite its fragile state, it exuded an aura of quiet intelligence, an awareness that went beyond its physical form. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was watching him, studying him, even when its eyes were closed. He often caught it staring at him with that unnerving intensity, as though it understood far more than it should. Grace seemed to feel it too. She would glance at the creature from time to time, her brow furrowing as though she was trying to make sense of it. I've never seen anything like it, she murmured one night as they worked together. It's like it's not even from this world. Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the creature. I don't think it is, he replied softly. The secrets of the forest. The days passed and the creature continued to recover, though Ethan's unease never truly dissipated. He spent every waking moment with it, watching over it, caring for it. He couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for it, as if it had been brought to him for a reason. But that reason remained a mystery. One evening, as he sat by the creature's side, deep in thought, a strange noise caught his attention. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. But as the seconds ticked by, the noise grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a low, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere outside the clinic. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his body tense. Grace, who had been preparing the creature's next meal, looked up in confusion. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Grace listened for a moment, then nodded slowly. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with unease. Ethan's gaze shifted to the window where the moonlight filtered through the blinds. He couldn't see anything outside, but the noise was unmistakable. It was coming closer. Suddenly, the clinic door slammed open, and Ben Carter burst in, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Dr. Hayes, you need to come with me," Ben said urgently. "There's something in the woods. Something I've never seen before." Ethan's stomach dropped. The journey into the woods. Ben led them to his truck, and together they drove out to the edge of the woods, the sound of the thumping growing louder with each passing moment. Ethan's heart raced, and his mind was filled with 1,000 questions. What could be out there, so close to town? And why had Ben been the one to find it? The truck bumped along the dirt road, and the trees began to thin as they approached the clearing where Ben had first found the creature. The night air was thick with tension, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. When they reached the clearing, Ben stopped the truck and turned off the engine. Ethan's eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw it. In the center of the clearing, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall, far taller than any human. Its body was obscured by shadows, but Ethan could see its outline clearly. Its eyes, glowing with the same eerie light as the creature in the clinic, locked onto him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was no animal. This was something else. Something far older, far more dangerous. To be continued.